Hello, everyone, and welcome to Global Politics with Dr. Detzi and Dr. Kusluch. So today we wanted to do an introduction video, introduce ourselves, and then just a short discussion about some of the recent events in the Middle East, maybe what the news isn't covering as much as we think they should. We'll talk a bit about Russia's role in it, how Russia is benefiting from the conflict, and then we will go from there. So I will let my colleague Dr. Detzi introduce himself.
All right. Hello. My name's Dan Detzi. I I wouldn't say I'm focused on the Middle East, but I am focused on the Middle East in a lot of my research, especially some comparative foreign policy. I really started out focused really on North Africa and the Middle East together, but have been recently, well, I wouldn't say recently, I'd say for the last 15 years was really interested in Yemen and the conflict in Yemen, and it kind of spread out from there. So before this conflict with Iran started, I'm actually doing research on um, uh, kind of comparative foreign policies, national interest between states in the region concerning Yemen and the conflict in Yemen, because it's embroiled so many different states and players in there. So it's real interesting to include Iran and Saudi Arabia and even the United States. So some of my background, I am a retired Air Force officer. I've been retired for about 10 years now. I taught at the United States Air Force Academy for 6 years, both as a military instructor and then as a civilian instructor, taught foreign policy, international relations, American politics, so the gambit. Um, Currently, yeah, I'm just doing my research on the Middle East and comparative foreign policy.
Awesome, awesome. And so I am Joseph Kusluch. So my background is a little different than Dan's. I'm a purely an academic, not an academic slash practitioner. So my research is it's evolving. So my PhD dissertation, my graduate school research was on Russian politics domestically. And since graduating, I have started looking at it more through an IR perspective from a U.S. national security perspective. So thinking about, okay, well, what's going on in Russia and how does it impact the rest of the world instead of my dissertation, which looked at protests in Russia simply from the perspective of what's going on in Russia. Now I'm starting to think more about, well, how does this impact the rest of the world? How does what happens domestically in an authoritarian regime actually impact the rest of the world? Like I'm looking at I'm publishing, no, presenting next month at Midwest, where I look at, okay, well, when we see protests in Russia, how does that impact their foreign policy? How does American foreign policy impact Russian protests? So definitely still evolving on my research and the evolution of it. Teaching wise, I teach across the political spectrum from American politics to IR comparative. Just like many academics today, you have to wear many hats because it's just the nature of the modern university where you have the opportunity and it's a fun opportunity to teach a lot of different courses. But for my research, still evolving. So I just wanted to bring up that I met Dan because we both worked at the Air Force Academy. I certainly was not there as long, but I was there as I was finishing my PhD. So together we taught courses on American national security. I taught international political economy at the academy. So a nice time at the academy, but I have recently moved to the University of Northern Colorado, where I've been for 3 years now. So that's who Dan is. That's who I am. That's how we know each other. And we, over the past couple months, I would say, we're talking about starting a dialogue like this, where we have the opportunity to talk about global politics, to talk about international relations, comparative politics. to try to just have a dialogue about the world in a slightly deeper way than maybe you sometimes see in the news. So you might see like a 30-second segment on the news, and it doesn't really put what's happening in the world into much context. So we figured this would be an opportunity for us to talk about things we're interested in, maybe incorporate things our students are interested in if they have questions as a jumping off point to talk about. So, kind of who we are and why we are here today. So, um, Dan, if you wanted to kick
Yeah.
off the conversation about your comparative foreign policy, the Middle East.
Yeah. And before I guess leading into this, I forgot to
Yeah,
mention,
please.
Joe, you mentioned about practitioner. I did forget to mention that was before I got to the academy, I did work on the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the Joint Staff, working on policy in North Africa and West Africa, so the Sahel region and North Africa during the time of the Arab Spring. So this is what got me kind of I cut my teeth on actual foreign policy and understanding how the process worked within the United States
Yeah,
anyway, but also working with partner nations or not partner nations, whoever they might be. And so that got me rolling in some of the stuff that I'm talking about today. Again, not in that time, not Middle East, but North Africa, which played into the Middle East. And I got I focused on foreign policy in Yemen for my master's degree, and of course the being assigned to the Pentagon, they didn't assign me to the Yemen desk because, why do that? So, so put me somewhere where I knew nothing about, but I got to learn a lot about it and learn about policy. So that's why when Joe, when you're saying you watch the news, you see these really, really shallow takes on on policy or what's going on, it frustrates me. So it's like, what are you talking? You don't know what you're talking about. I mean, I'm not a expert on everything Middle East, but I do know a little bit enough to say that sometimes when I hear stuff in the news, I'm like, that's completely out to lunch, or why didn't that reporter follow up on a question about, that person just said X when they should have said Y, and it was way out. So that's what kind of got me interested in what I'm about to kind of bring up, and that's the Middle East and the conflict in Iran. Not necessarily the conflict itself, but um, when you watch the news, wherever you get it, it's usually from a United States perspective. Um, uh, and usually in the United States, when they're talking about national interests, they're talking about U.S. national interests. And surprise, surprise, U.S. national interests aren't the same as Saudi national interests or Iranian national interests or Jordanian international interests. They're all different. Um, but the new, whatever media, and even if they're analysts talking on TV or elsewhere, kind of aggregate where they clump together everyone's national interest into the same thing if they're partner nations or allies. Um, so this is where I want to start. It's this idea that every state's national interest, or at least national security interest too, starts with this idea that we want security, we want stability in the region. Every country wants that. The problem is is that different states have different ideas of what security means to them or stability means to them, and that might contradict what it means to another country like the United States. Let's think externally, way across the ocean, the United States or Japan or China, completely different. But I want to focus on the region itself. So you probably have heard of the idea of great power competition, where you have these major powers like the United States, Russia, China competing with spheres of influence. Um, Now shrink that down to regions. Regions have those same kind of power dynamics. So there's regional power competition. And that's why I just wanted to introduce today in the Middle East, because it's not really brought out when we're talking about the war in Iran all that much, but it matters. So in my notes here, I wrote down, like, if you're gonna say who was the most powerful, influential nation in the Middle East region, and I'm talking when I say the Middle East, I mean basically from Egypt into the Arabian Peninsula, the Gulf states, Jordan, Israel, Turkey, and Iran. So that's what I'm talking about by the Middle East. Afghanistan, Pakistan, that's not the Middle East, that's Central Asia into South Asia. So completely different region. Doesn't mean they don't have interactions, but for foreign policy stakes, this is where I'm holding my line here. So within that region, I broke it down to four tiers of power, right? Tier one being the most powerful, tier four being those really barely holding it together states, right? So tier one powers, as of now, I would put in obviously Saudi Arabia, Iran, Turkey, Egypt, and Israel. Israel, I put in parentheses here because it's a little bit different um, in the sense that it's not as traditional as some of these other bigger countries, but definitely has a huge influence on the region. And up until about I don't know, I'd say about 8 years ago, I wouldn't say that. I'd say longer than that, but Israel is kind of the persona non grata state of the region. Like other states would not recognize it, but now most states in the region have recognized Israel as part of the region, an equal player. Um, obviously, they have a lot of power and influence. So they're tier one along with these other big ones. Second tier, United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Jordan. Um, Third tier, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, all rich with resources, all in a strategic area, but not necessarily um, militarily powerful. Those tier three states and tier four, these kind of quasi-failed states, Yemen and Lebanon. Right. So I might be missing one, but I don't think so. I'll go through my mind here. But yeah, that's basically it. So you think of that and you think, okay, there's power tiers, and within those tiers, they're competing. And this competition is tradition. It's has a long history, and it's not necessarily a competition as we kind of see it when I watch the news and they talk about Iran and Saudi Arabia being part of the Arab world. Well, Iran is not part of the Arab world. Turkey is not part of the Arab world. Turkey is they're Turkish, and in Iran, Persian. They speak Farsi, a completely different language, completely different culture than the Arabs. Their alphabet's the same, but different language. It's like saying that English and Portuguese are the same language just because they use the same alphabet relatively. Um, but it's not true. So there's this Persian Arab rivalry that's gone on for a long time. Um, and since really um, the the revolution in Iran in 1979, the Arab and Persian competition has been more distinct. So in 1979, when the Islamic Republic took over, Iraq was kind of that Arab power that was holding the line in the Arab world. Saudi Arabia was not nearly as strong as it is now in any way, shape, or form. Neither were the Gulf states. So it was Iran and Iraq. Iraq took advantage of the political instability in Iran in 1980 and invaded. So there's this long 8 year war. And I'm old enough to remember this I wasn't growing yet, but I was a kid and in high school in the later years when the United States got involved. But the United States, surprisingly, maybe to a lot of people who watch here, was backing Saddam Hussein in Iraq because this is when we became antagonistic against Iran, and that has its own long history, right? That you can look into. But Iraq was that Arab power that was holding the line against the Persian power of Iran in the Arab world, holding the line in the Arab world uh, up until, um, and I would even say, well, I'd say up until 2003 when the United States deposed Saddam Hussein and basically defanged Iraq. So Iraq was out of the picture. Now you have Saudi Arabia holding this Arab line against the Persians in this competition. Um, and they see themselves not only as the kind of holding the line in the Arab world, but also as the kind of the keeper of the traditions of Islam. So they have Medina and Mecca, obviously. So whether you're Sunni or Shia or any other sect of Islam, you're going to do your pilgrimages to this area. And Saudi Arabia is seen as the keeper of these holy sites. So they hold a different power in that sense. So along with this Persian Arab line, there's also within the um, Muslim world the Sunni Shia um, line. So uh, Iran being majority Shia, the rest of the Persian Gulf region or the Arabian Peninsula being Sunni. Not all, but majority. Um, so it's also this competition, right, that's going on in the region, kind of this spiritual fight for the Islamic world. And I'm not a Islamic scholar or a religious scholar, so I'm not going to. I know a little bit about it, but I'm not going to delve into to the ins and outs of that. But it holds sway in their foreign policies, in their interactions in the region, both religion and also this cultural, historical kind of rivalry between whether it's Persian and Arab or Turk and Arab. So the Turks are their own power too that hold their own uh, culture, history, language that's different from the Arab world, different from the Persian world. Um, it's an interesting region. I don't, it obviously does not get captured um, in the news this way. So let me just pick up, and I'm going to end this shortly here, but these other rivalries, especially after Iraq was deposed in 2003, or at least Saddam Hussein, um, this new rivalry with Saudi Arabia and Iran kind of popped up. It wasn't necessarily a military rivalry, but certainly a rivalry nonetheless for influence in the region. Um, but also below that, you have these sub rivalries between Saudi Arabia and UAE. I don't know if you caught the news. It was back in, I think, December in Yemen. Saudi Arabia bombed a UAE, an Emirates port there because they were both working together to stabilize Yemen. But UAE went their own direction, started supporting separatists. Uh, and that's a whole, I can get into that in another episode, but they're Saudis being the power said, no, you're not going to do that, bombed their supply depot. And UAE quickly kind of pulled back and said, okay, we're just getting out of Yemen altogether. And so that was his own thing. Um, so you have that rivalry. You also have UAE and Qatar. These two states, again, we see this on the news as, hey, these Gulf states are all together. They're all in this together. They all are getting hit by Iran. That does not mean they're all in it for each other, right? So
Yeah.
UAE and Qatar are big rivalries. They've been uh, expanding their power outside the region to include in Libya and Sudan. They're backing different factions of these civil wars. So it's just a really interesting rivalry and competition between UAE and Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And a lot of times this all coalesces in Yemen, and that's why I study Yemen because it's a really interesting conflict. Um, and if you want to go back in history too, between okay, you have the cultural, you have the religious, you have but also this idea of hereditary monarchies versus republics. That was the big thing in the 60s. Um, Now you don't have many republics left. You do have obviously Iraq in there, I think is the holding the line of republics. But yeah, that used to be a rivalry as well, and that was its own thing. But definitely Iran is against hereditary monarchies, even though they just handed down the grand Ayatollah status to the son of the late Ayatollah. So Grand Ayatollah, which is against the revolutionary edicts of Iran. So they
Yeah.
were completely against hereditary monarchies like Saudi Arabia. So that's another kind of rivalry or push. Um, so yeah, national security or security and stability means something different to each of these states. They each have their different views of the region, who should be in power, um, or who should be more powerful, or who deserves to be. And they do. And I want to pass this over to Joe here to talk about a bit because within this web of rivalry and intrigue, now you throw in external players that come in and use it as a competition ground themselves, which has happened since, the days of the British Empire and colonialism. There's a reason they speak French in Beirut, right? Or um, the Gulf states are pretty fluent in English because you have the British and French colonial states within there that have history. But now in the Cold War, you had the United States, USSR, and even though USSR has gone and but Russia has risen up and has recently uh, come back into the Middle East, in especially in Syria, but also in interactions with Iran. The United States has never left. Saw a story today about how the United States just cannot turn away from the Middle East and look at China because it's just I don't know, it's a shiny object for the United States to not
Yeah.
leave. But so within this web of intrigue in the Middle East, now you throw in these external powers, the United States, which I mentioned. I'll close out to where I started. If you watch, or when I watch the news, I get frustrated because it's very much this is the U.S. perspective on the Middle East, and it's about as shallow as a 1 inch pool, you know. So um, I think we could do better as a society, learning a little bit more about these regions we go to war. And Joe knows this when I talk to my classes at the Air Force Academy, I'd have them point to Afghanistan or Iran on a map without labels, and they couldn't do it, right? So I think it's the same with, and it's not saying anything against the American knowledge. It's just like, well, if you're going to go to war um, in these regions, you should, especially if you're at the United States Air Force Academy, you should be able to point to where you're going to war in. And it's the same with U.S. society, or at least, you know, media and society. It's a very shallow representation of what's actually going on in some of these and why the United States is there, or why Iran is fighting back, or why Saudi Arabia and these other countries are have recently said, "Hey, United States, keep fighting." Saudi Arabia says, "Keep going until you have a complete shift in the status quo." Well, that's because Saudi Arabia is their biggest enemy is Iran, and they don't want a status quo back, even though it really wouldn't matter to the United States all that much. So I'm going to throw it over to Joe to talk about, okay, how does Russia see this? And I'll let you go from there.
Yeah, if I can ask you a couple follow-up questions
Yeah.
that you spiked there. So, do you think that there is, even at the highest levels of government, not to name names or anything, but do you think there is a misunderstanding of the complexity of the region? That from a U.S. national security standpoint, we think, oh, we we can solve the Middle East, or we can, from as an outside force, change public policy in the Middle East. But yet we know there's these complexities. Do you think maybe there's an underappreciation at times for how complex these rivalries, these domestic political scenes are? This idea that, yeah, that even within the GCC countries, there isn't a homogenous idea of what national interest means.
Mhm.
And then if we have this misunderstanding, do we think maybe that's why at times external countries find it so hard to be quote successful in the Middle East?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't think it's necessarily a sometimes it's a misunderstanding of the complexity in the way so it's complex, but the way it's kind of interpreted is misunderstood. Like if you look at the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, people say, well, it's complex. It's been going on for thousands of years. It hasn't been going on for thousands of years. It's been going on since 1947. Maybe if you want to talk about the uh, early 1900s, when the movement to for the Jewish population to return to the Palestinian territory or that was controlled by the British at the time. You could start there, but it hasn't been going on for thousands of years. Same with like if you're talking about the Persian Arab uh, conflict, yeah, you can go back and look at stuff from the turn of the millennium, into uh, the rise of Islam. But really, the competitions for that really go back to the decolonization era, the time when Great Britain and France kind of pulled back. That's when kind of the history starts, post World War II in that sense, in all aspects of the complexity of it. So in a lot of sense, you'll say, yeah, it's complex. It's gone on for thousands of years. How are we supposed to solve it? Well, we had a lot of say in what was going on and to cause the issues. I talked about Iran and the revolution. There's plenty of literature and uh, evidence-based research on how the United States actually kind of caused that upheaval because we had a Shah of Iran who was friendly to the United States. So we propped that Shah up against some other states that were more aligned with the Soviet Union. But in the end, when the Shah kind of nationalized oil, the United States took issue with that and um, kind of caused some turmoil. So um, the complexity isn't always the complexity that the news brings it out to be. It's not this 1,000-year-old or millennium-old fight. It's pretty relatively recent. It is complex, and the United States and these external powers do have a part to play in how the mess was started. So when you see the news, especially from the U.S. perspective, it's like, oh, Iran is untrustworthy. If you hear U.S. officials speak, U.S. is untrustworthy, or United Iran is untrustworthy. They always lie, they always cheat and steal. You hear from the Iranian perspective, it's the same directed back at the United States, and both have validity. Both have cheated each other throughout the last 75 years. So the complexity is there, but it's not described as it really is. And
Okay.
it's not intractable. That's the correct word, but it's definitely not this like intertwined 1,000-year-old battle between different sects and different groups, and the United States is just trying to, separate the countries so that we can just all get along. That's not how it is. Yeah. Did that answer
Yeah,
your question?
perfect. Yeah, yeah, perfect. Thank you. So as the conflict in Iran started and then expanded, um, as someone that's looked at and focused and thought about Russia, my initial instincts were how's this conflict going to impact Russia? And then by extension, how is this conflict going to impact the Ukrainians? And my initial response was that maybe it would actually help the Ukrainians because it would pull some attention away from one of Russia's few, I don't want to say allies, but friends. We know that the Iranians have been supplying the Russians with Shahad drones. Um, we know that the Russians are starting to manufacture them themselves at home. But I thought, okay, initially, I wonder how the Ukrainians might benefit from this. And then as the past several weeks have gone on, I started wondering, well, I actually wonder how the Russians are going to benefit from this conflict. And so we're already seeing discussions in Brussels, discussions in Washington, D.C., of maybe bringing Russia in from the cold. Because if there's a global supply um, chain shortage of oil, gas, countries might turn towards Russia. And so what started out as, I don't want to say optimism or hope, though, maybe the Ukrainians can benefit from this simply because Russia is losing a friend. All of a sudden, it seems like Russia might be the beneficiaries now. They are manufacturing their own drones. The U.S. just lifted a 30-day moratorium on oil tankers. So the Russians now get to sell more oil at a higher price. They might be brought in from the cold. So politically, they're not as ostracized. And importantly, what I wanted to talk to you about with Dan is how it's pulling so much media attraction away from the conflict. So if you look at the front page of the Washington Post, and I was in a couple meetings today. So I was missing maybe what's on the front page of the Washington Post, but it's probably not the Russia Ukraine conflict. And so to me, the conflict might end up benefiting, especially in the short run here, the Russians, hurting the Ukrainians because now we're not paying attention to that conflict. If there's asks for more supplemental defensive funds, that might just get buried in Congress or buried elsewhere, and then the Ukrainians could turn could end up being losers in this. And so, to me, and when I talk to a lot of my students is about when we talk about foreign policy or international relations, is how events that are so seemingly disconnected are actually still impacting each other. And so, if we started our discussion with the complexity of the Middle East, well, it shows the complexity of the global system, where the Ukrainians are still fighting a war, still having their territory slowly encroached on further and further. But now they might turn, um, they might be negatively impacted from this.
Yeah. Something
So,
can I
no, please,
I was going
please,
to say,
please.
sorry to interrupt. I'm not sorry to interrupt. I always like interrupting. This what you brought up is interesting because I saw today it was kind of a bottom ticker I think of BBC News when I was watching it was G7 is meeting. So these G7 economic powers, and it said French a French minister was talking says and it said Europe or NATO is ready to help the US with the Strait of Hormuz. So one thing to think about connections, you say, okay, well, why would the Europeans, after saying no, we're not, would they say, okay, now we're going to? One of those goes back to your comment, Joe, is that probably Europeans aren't. They're like their biggest concern when we're talking about what does security mean to different states. Ukraine and the Russia question is their biggest security question. So
Yeah,
I doubt that the Europeans would agree to help with the Strait of Hormuz unless there was some guarantee by the United States that they were not going to forget about Ukraine and the defense of Ukraine and
yeah.
so I that's something to watch too. Like, okay, if there's this agreement, what's the other side of it? And I'm guessing that it's like don't forget about Ukraine and Europe.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And so I agree with that, but we know in democracies where leaders are being held accountable by their electorate, and you see energy costs quickly rising. And bad here in the United States, but even worse in Europe. That does put a lot of pressure on democratically elected leaders to do something. And that
Hmm.
might be okay, we ease some of the restrictions on Russian oil,
Hmm.
Russian natural gas. So I know what you mean. The security threat is Russia to many European, Central European countries, Eastern European states, even Western European states. But there is still the domestic political aspect of it. Of okay,
Hmm.
if energy costs continue to rise week after week, that does put pressure on leaders to okay, well, what can we do to alleviate some of this pressure? And
Hmm.
so that to me is I worry will put pressure on countries to buy more Russian oil.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe I'm wrong because again, because the threat there is Russia. When we read about what the European leaders think, they we can see their conferences where they talk about well the Strait of Hormuz, and then Iran in general wasn't really a concern of ours. Like it was
Hmm.
something we had to worry about, but Russia is the threat, so maybe that will remain the over.
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
Yeah,
so
the Strait of Hormuz crisis has brought out some strange bedfellows and to include the United States lifting sanctions on Iranian oil.
yeah,
The craziest
yeah,
thing to think of, but both Russian and Iranian oil, because the interest of the United States is just to get that the United States has plenty of energy on its own, but it's tied to the world market, right? So this is something that the media does, has hit on. That's a good thing to like. Why does it matter if the Strait of Hormuz is closed to the United States? Well, it matters because we're globalized, and now it's about putting more out into the system, more oil out in the system to lower prices, which lowers the domestic costs for citizens of the United States. Therefore, they'd be less apt to say, "What are we doing in the Middle East?" There'll
Yeah.
be so it's interesting the outcome if we think of like the day after, whatever that is, when this conflict is over, when everything settles down back to a status quo, what is going to be the policy of the United States, of Europe, of Russia, of the Middle East concerning oil um, as an energy source, as the primary energy fuel, for no better word, of the global economy. Um, After the crisis in the 70s, again with Iran in the Middle East and the conflicts there, the United States learned quickly that it needed to depend on its own energy sources, and we did. The United States did do that, but we also globalized in that more we're more entwined in the next 30 or 40 years, which okay, it does still matter. But now after this is over, are we going to have that same kind of revolution in our thinking about energy? Um, I'm surprised that the idea of green energy hasn't, or at least renewable energy hasn't been popping up. Like, yes, this is why we need. I mean, China
Yeah.
gets it. China's the leading manufacturer, like solar panels, and they're transitioning because they know this dependency is not going to be helpful for them. Excuse me. So I assume that the rest of the globe. I don't think the United States at this point, domestic politics wise, is going to make that jump. We have right now an administration who is wholly um, against renewable energy. That is what it is. But once this administration is out, and it will be at some point, a new one comes in, they may or may not focus on renewable, but they might point at this um,
Yeah.
conflict in the Middle East, the conflict in Ukraine with Russia, as a point. Hey, we got to think about, even though we're globalized, how do we secure up our energy sourcing? What's it going to be? Is it
Yeah.
going to be nuclear energy? Is it going to be wind energy? Is it going to be? It's going to be a combo. Um, yeah, so it's
Because we
interesting.
hear a lot of even seemingly unrelated issues talked about in Congress as national security issues,
Mhm.
even if it doesn't seem like on the surface how is this connected to national security? We see these policies talked about as, oh, this is a national security policy. So I agree that I wouldn't be surprised if a growth maybe in the next administration in green energy is worded, especially if it requires a lot of public funds up front, like under the
Mhm.
Obama administration when they were trying to push for more renewable energies as a way to market. Okay, we need to spend more money because we saw what happens when there are global disruptions in the energy market. So I agree with you there, and I think that is something that maybe the next administration, even maybe if it's a Republican administration, will will articulate in a way that this administration doesn't.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think again, if you watch the news, it's very short-sighted. U.S. policy and other policies like, well, you take control militarily of the Strait of Hormuz, that will solve the problem. Like maybe that's the end state of the war for the United States is we have military control, kind of like we had control of the Panama Canal for a long time. Um, Maybe that's where it's going to come, but that's a very short-sighted. Okay, that's going to work in the next, 5, 10 years, but what next? So
yeah,
um, so that's where the news doesn't really, the media or even policymakers don't look that far ahead. I'm sure there's others in think tanks and other areas that look much further ahead. Economics, obviously, people who study economics or IP, international political economy, are going to be looking. Okay, what's this mean for the world's energy policy for the next couple decades? And I think that's going to be the interesting thing that comes out of this, both the conflict in Ukraine and in the Middle East right now.
yeah, perfect. So if I could ask you one more question, Dan, um, just because as we think about how Middle Eastern conflicts and outside forces like Russia. One thing that surprised me and many others was how poorly Russian logistics and then how poorly the Russian military fought in the initial full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But we know that the Russians were helping Assad in Syria leading during the civil war in Syria. So it surprised me as someone that had seen Russian military forces. I don't want to say practicing, but practicing their craft in Syria. So, does it surprise you how poorly that the Russians have um, um, done in Ukraine after years of being in the Middle East and contributing to the Assad regime, recapturing a lot of territory over the 10 year civil war?
Well, I don't know if the I don't know. I didn't study how the Russians performed in
Yeah,
Ukraine. Um, but it's much like the United States and Iran right now. The United States is the world's biggest military, most expensive military power, is not necessarily achieving its political aims right now, anyway. Um, so, and we found out in Vietnam, we found out in Iraq that, it's hard to kind of achieve some of these political goals with just military force. It's just not
yeah,
something that happens. So I wouldn't say that the Russians did not perform well. I think they were very surprised with the capabilities of the Ukrainians with regards to, well, further on down the road with drones. I mean, they kind of started that whole, and I'm not talking about the big drones, the suicide one, but the like store-bought ones, right? That can go.
yeah.
So kind of this attrition. I think the Russians too, when history looks back, this will show that they weren't necessarily looking to, I think they were hoping for a quick victory, like swinging in just into the northwest of the country, but that got repelled. Um, I think history will see it as, well, this is the Russian style of conflict, this war of attrition. Um, if it's a war of attrition, they're going to win. I mean, it's just
Yeah.
numbers and their economy and where they manufacture things. And same with what happened in World War II. So I can't say I'm surprised that they slowed it. I'm more surprised at Ukraine's ability to hang in there more than
Okay.
anything,
Yeah.
and to fight back. I think it was just a miscalculation, maybe from the Russians.
Yeah.
But when they regrouped and said, "Okay, this is going to be more of we're just going to attrit," and I don't think Putin cares that it lasts long. I think that's to his advantage.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, so for the regards to Syria, I don't. Yeah, that's another like Cold War era kind of thing with the Soviets in helping with the North Vietnamese and the VC helping them fight the United States in Vietnam, but also the United States helping the Mujahideen in Afghanistan fight the Soviet Union when they were there and really stymied the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Um, so I think these missions to Syria for Russia at the time, or to, maybe to Afghanistan for the US during when the Russians were there, these advisory roles are just to keep, um, yeah, it's not really honing their skills all that much.
Okay.
I think it's more of gaining or maintaining their reputation in that region, at least for the Assad. Now, again, the Assad
Yeah.
regime in the end did fall. So I don't think they have a play in Syria anymore, which is interesting. So they kind of failed in Syria as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And it does make me wonder uh, if because the conflict in Ukraine has become such a stalemate that they weren't able to help Assad when clearly
oh,
Assad was
yeah,
in
yeah,
trouble and
yeah. That's
needed
a good point.
help.
Yeah, that's
And
good.
and so that then raises the question of, because I don't know if we could call them allies, but like, does what do Russia's remaining friends think about their friendship with Russia.
Yeah.
If Assad was clearly in trouble and the Russians weren't there to help, if you're a remaining friend of Russia, like, do you really trust that the Russians will come help you
Mhm.
if you need it?
Yeah, and that's a cool question. I think the same could be flipped back to the United States. Is the United because the United States abandoned their Kurdish allies in Syria at a time when it was uh, kind of necessary to be there. And same with the Russians. So this is where external forces going into the Middle East or any other area is problematic. Um, Not because the United States or Russia are not capable of turning the tide of something, but it's just like how much stomach do they have to, how much blood and treasure are they willing to spend
Yeah,
in some of these backwaters, um, per se. Like if you look at China, China has not gotten involved in any excursions, as
yeah,
call those excursions. They're focused on their their region there in the South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan, but they haven't offered their help militarily to other countries other than building infrastructure and things like that. So they have a different model, which might
yeah,
turn out to be the more successful model because they don't tend to abandon. Now they don't treat these countries very well that they they work in, but if you think of the continent of Africa or even South
yeah,
America, where uh, China's coming in to help build infrastructure, it's not a military push. Same with the
yeah. It's
Middle East.
purely economics.
Yeah. So it's a
Yeah.
whole different model of interaction and influence. Um, so yeah, I probably left your question a long time ago down the road, but
No, no,
but,
it's
but
perfect.
it's this. I don't think that people mistrust or not. I think smaller powers will not hesitate to ask for help from Russia or the United States if they think, even though if they know it's transactional militarily, they'll probably expect them not to stay the long haul. They just say, "Hey, give me your training and weapons, and we'll go from there." Whereas, like China's like, "Well, here's weapons. I'm not going to train you, but here's weapons and money and
Yeah,
whatever." So it's less transactional or less, I guess, complex with China with these other countries. Um, a lot of times the United States will want something in return with regards to governance or something like that. Or
yeah,
um, I don't know what Russia wants in return, from Syria, other than having the port. And God, now I forget the name of the port, but it was like the last remaining base that Russia had in the Middle East. Um, it was a naval base, so it gave them a presence in the Mediterranean rather than having
yeah,
to come through the Black Sea. So it had its own strategic depth for Russia, even post-Soviet Union. Um, so it wasn't just you know for nothing for Russia. Now Russia is getting involved in some places in West Africa where they
yeah,
don't have a military presence, but they want access for resources. And so that's why they have those militia. No, they're not
the
militias.
Wagner Group.
Yeah, the Wagner Group, the paramilitaries are are hoisting the Russian flag down there. I don't know. I haven't looked in a while, but they might have drained that. But yeah, they want access to resources in a sense, so they're giving them military training and help in West Africa and the Sahel region. Whereas again, China is just like, you want a port built? Okay, we're going to give you a port, but that we also
Yeah,
um, we reserve the right to use this port in time of conflict too. So it's kind of the same. It's like access. There are strings attached, but China is not getting involved with military conflicts, whereas Russia and the United States, that's just unfortunately, our tradition, if you will. I think it's unfortunate because they turn into I hate to use the word quagmire, but they bog these countries down,
yeah.
both Russia and the United States. Um, so yeah.
Okay, so I
That
think,
was a long path to
yeah,
really
yeah,
talking about the issue.
I think that's a good place to leave our first episode here. Kind of give us something to open the discussion with. We will plan on meeting on Fridays. So thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you.